It was a bright, sunny afternoon in Pinewood Heights. This was a small, quiet neighborhood where houses sat close together, and kids rode bikes down the street. The trees were tall, the grass was green, and everything looked peaceful. Everyone knew each other here, or at least, they thought they did. People waved when they passed by. They smiled and said, "Hi." They shared cookies sometimes or talked about the weather. It was that kind of place. But something new was about to shake things up. Someone new had just rolled into town. His name was Jake Miller. Jake was the new guy on the block. He wasn't loud or fancy. He didn't show off or act big. He was just a regular dude. He drove an old, beat-up truck that made funny noises when it stopped. The truck was rusty, and the paint was peeling off in little bits. But Jake didn't care. He liked it just fine. He had dark hair that stuck up a little, and he wore a plain blue shirt and jeans. When he smiled, it was a big, friendly smile that made you feel like you'd known him forever. Most people in Pinewood Heights saw him and thought, "Oh, he seems nice." They waved at him as he pulled into the driveway of his new house. It was a small house with white walls and a red door. Nothing fancy, but it was his. Jake hopped out of his truck and started unloading boxes. He had a lot of stuff: big boxes, small boxes, even a chair with wobbly legs. He carried them one by one, stacking them on his porch. The neighbors peeked out their windows or stepped outside to watch. "Who's this guy?" they whispered to each other. "Where'd he come from?" Some waved hello. "Welcome to the neighborhood," they called out. Jake waved back, wiping sweat off his forehead. "Thanks," he said, his voice cheerful and loud. He seemed like the kind of guy who'd fit right in. Everyone liked him, well, almost everyone. There was one person who didn't wave. One person who didn't smile. Her name was Karen Baxter. Karen wasn't like the other neighbors. Oh no, she was different. She wasn't just any lady on the street, she was the queen of the homeowners association. People called it the HOA for short. The HOA made rules for the neighborhood. Rules like cut your grass every week or don't paint your house purple. It was supposed to keep everything neat and pretty. And Karen? She loved those rules. She loved them more than anything. She walked around like she was the boss of everyone and everything. She wore bright pink shirts and big sunglasses, even when it wasn't sunny. Her hair was always perfect, like she spent hours fixing it. And when she talked, her voice was loud and sharp, like a teacher yelling at a kid who forgot his homework. Karen lived 3 houses down from Jake. Her house was the biggest on the street. It had a huge front yard with flowers in perfect rows. Her mailbox was shiny and gold, like something from a fancy store. She was proud of that house. Proud of her yard. Proud of her mailbox. To her, Pinewood Heights was her kingdom. She made sure every tree, every bush, every blade of grass followed her rules. If someone broke a rule, even a tiny one, she'd march right over and tell them off. "Fix it," she'd say, pointing her finger. "This is my neighborhood." Everyone listened to her because they didn't want trouble. Karen liked that. She liked being in charge. So, when Jake showed up with his rusty truck and his plain little house, Karen noticed right away. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching him. Her eyes narrowed behind her big sunglasses. She didn't like what she saw. That truck? Too old. Too loud. Those boxes? Too messy. And Jake? He didn't look like he belonged in her perfect Pinewood Heights. She didn't wave. She didn't say hello. She just stared, her lips pressed tight together. "Who does this guy think he is?" she grumbled to herself. "Moving in here like he owns the place? No way." Jake didn't see her at first. He was too busy carrying a box full of books. He dropped it on the porch with a thud and stretched his arms. That's when he looked up and saw Karen staring. She was far away, but he could feel her eyes on him. Like a hawk watching a mouse. He gave her a little wave, just to be nice. "Hey there," he called out. But Karen didn't wave back. She turned her head and walked inside, slamming her door. Boom. The sound echoed down the street. Jake scratched his head. "Huh," he said. "Guess she's not a fan." The other neighbors saw it too. Mrs. Lopez, who lived next door to Jake, was watering her flowers. She shook her head and muttered, "Oh boy, Karen's already mad. Mr. Thompson, an old man with a cane, sat on his porch and chuckled. New guy's in for it now, he said. Everyone knew Karen. They knew she didn't like change. And Jake? He was change. A big, walking, talking change with a rusty truck and a friendly smile. To Karen, that was trouble. Big trouble. She didn't waste any time. That very afternoon, Karen grabbed her clipboard. It was a shiny silver clipboard with papers clipped to it, papers full of HOA rules. She marched down the street, her pink shoes clicking on the sidewalk. Click, click, click. She stopped right in front of Jake's house. He was still unpacking, sitting on his porch with a glass of water. The sun was hot, and he was taking a break. Karen stood there, staring at him again. Jake looked up and smiled. Hi, he said. Nice day, huh? Karen didn't smile back. You're new here, she said. Her voice was cold, like ice. I'm Karen Baxter. I run the HOA. She held up her clipboard like it was a crown. We have rules in Pinewood Heights. Lots of rules. And I'm guessing you don't know them. Jake tilted his head. Oh, okay, he said. What kind of rules? Karen sniffed, like she couldn't believe he had to ask. Rules to keep this place perfect, she said. Your truck, for one thing, it's ugly. It doesn't fit here. And your house? That red door? Red's not allowed. You'll have to paint it? Jake blinked. Paint my door, he asked. But I like red. Karen's eyes got wide. You don't get it, do you? She snapped. This isn't about what you like. It's about what I say. I mean, what the HOA says. And that truck? Park it somewhere else. It's ruining the view. Jake looked at his truck. It was old, sure, but it worked just fine. He shrugged. It's my truck, he said. I need it. Karen's face turned pink. Need it or not, she said, it's a problem. Fix it, or you'll hear from me again. Then she turned and marched back to her house. Click, click, click. Jake watched her go. He didn't say anything. He just took a sip of his water and smiled a little. But it wasn't a regular smile. It was a sneaky smile. A smile that said, oh, you'll see. See, Karen thought she knew everything about Jake. She thought he was just some new guy who didn't matter. She thought she could boss him around, like she bossed everyone else. But she was wrong. Jake wasn't just any guy. He had a secret. A big one. A secret that would flip her perfect little world upside down. What was that secret? Oh, I can't tell you yet. That'd ruin the fun. But here's a hint, Jake wasn't scared of Karen. Not one bit. While she was muttering to herself about his truck and his red door, Jake was already thinking ahead. He knew something she didn't. Something that would make her wish she'd never messed with him. What could it be? Was he rich? Was he famous? Was he something else? Hang on tight, because this story's just getting started. The neighbors were curious too. Mrs. Lopez put down her watering can and walked over to Jake's porch. Be careful with Karen, she said. She's tough. She'll make your life hard if you don't follow her rules. Jake nodded. Thanks for the heads up, he said. But I think I'll be okay. Mrs. Lopez raised an eyebrow. You sure? She asked. Jake's smile got bigger. Pretty sure, he said. She didn't know what to say to that, so she just went back to her flowers. Mr. Thompson, the old man with the cane, called out from his porch. Good luck, kid, he said. Karen's like a bulldog. Once she bites, she doesn't let go. Jake laughed. We'll see about that, he said. The neighbors looked at each other. They weren't sure what to think. Jake seemed nice, but he was new. And Karen? She was the boss. She always won. Right? Well, maybe not this time. Back at her house, Karen was already planning. She sat at her kitchen table with her clipboard, writing notes. Jake Miller, she said out loud. Troublemaker. Bad truck. Bad door. Needs to learn. She tapped her pen on the table. Tap, tap, tap. She didn't like Jake. Not one bit. He didn't fit in her perfect neighborhood. He didn't bow down to her like everyone else did. That made her mad. Really mad. I'll fix him, she said to herself. I'll show him who's in charge. But here's the thing, Karen didn't know Jake. Not really. She saw his truck and his house and thought, easy target. She thought he'd be like all the others, scared of her, quick to obey. But Jake wasn't scared. He wasn't worried. He sat on his porch, looking up at the sky, and that sneaky smile stayed on his face. He had a plan. A secret plan. Something big was coming, and Karen had no idea. She thought she was the queen, but queens can fall. And Jake? He was ready to make that happen. So, what was Jake hiding? Why wasn't he afraid? What was he going to do? You'll find out soon, I promise. This sunny afternoon in Pinewood Heights was just the start. The start of something wild. Something crazy. Something that would make everyone in the neighborhood talk for years. Karen thought she had it all under control, but Jake was about to surprise her and surprise you too. Stick around, because this story's only beginning. Jake sat on his porch a little longer, watching the sun start to dip lower in the sky. The air was warm, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves on the trees. Pinewood Heights looked so calm right now, like nothing could ever go wrong. But Jake knew better. He knew Karen was already plotting something. He could feel it. She wasn't the type to let things go. Not with that clipboard and those rules. She was like a bee buzzing around, looking for something to sting. And Jake? He was her new target. He leaned back in his chair, a wobbly old thing he'd brought from his last place, and took another sip of water. His truck sat in the driveway, quiet now, but still rusty and scratched. Karen hated that truck. Jake could tell. She'd looked at it like it was a pile of trash. But to Jake, it was more than just a truck. It meant something. Maybe it was a clue to his secret. Maybe it had a story of its own. What kind of story? Oh, we'll get to that later. For now, let's just say Jake wasn't worried about Karen's complaints. Not one bit. Across the street, a couple of kids rode by on their bikes. They were laughing and shouting, racing each other to the corner. One of them, a boy with a red cap, slowed down and looked at Jake. Hey, mister, he called out. You new here? Jake grinned and waved. Yep, he said. Just moved in today. The boy nodded. Cool truck, he said, then pedaled off to catch up with his friend. Jake chuckled. At least someone liked his truck. Karen sure didn't. Back at her house, Karen was still busy. She'd moved from the kitchen table to her living room now. It was a big room with fancy curtains and a huge couch. Pictures of flowers hung on the walls, and everything was super clean, like no one ever sat there. Karen didn't sit either. She paced back and forth, her pink shoes clicking on the floor. Click, click, click. She held her phone in one hand and her clipboard in the other. She was talking to someone important in the HOA. Yes, Linda, she said into the phone. There's a new guy. Jake Miller. He's already breaking rules. His truck's a mess, and his door's red. Red. Can you believe it? She stopped pacing and tapped her pen on the clipboard again. Tap, tap, tap. We need a meeting, she said. A big one. Tomorrow. Everyone needs to know about this. Linda, whoever she was, must have agreed, because Karen smiled a mean little smile. Good, she said. I'll write the letter tonight. He'll learn fast. Karen hung up the phone and sat down at her desk. She pulled out a piece of paper and started writing. Her pen moved quick, scratching loud against the page. To all Pinewood Heights residents, she wrote. We have a problem. A new neighbor, Jake Miller, is not following HOA rules. His truck is an eyesore. His door is the wrong color. We will meet tomorrow at 6 p.m. to talk about this. Be there. She signed her name in big, curly letters, Karen Baxter, HOA president. Then she leaned back in her chair and nodded. Perfect, she said to herself. He'll see who's boss. What Karen didn't know was that Jake wasn't far away. He was still on his porch, and he could hear bits of her loud voice drifting through her open window. Not all of it, just enough to know she was mad. Meeting tomorrow, huh, he said quietly to himself. That sneaky smile crept back onto his face. He didn't look scared. He didn't look nervous. He looked ready. Ready for what? That's the big question, isn't it? Karen thought she had him cornered, but Jake had something up his sleeve. Something she'd never guess. The sun was almost gone now, turning the sky orange and pink. Jake stood up and stretched. He grabbed one more box from his truck. This one was small, with tape all over it. It looked old, like it'd been moved a lot. He carried it inside and shut the door behind him. The red door. The one Karen hated so much. Inside, his house was still a mess. Boxes were everywhere. He didn't have much furniture yet, just that wobbly chair and a little table. But Jake didn't mind. He set the small box on the table and stared at it for a second. Soon, he whispered. Then he turned off the light and went to bed. Next door, Mrs. Lopez was still outside. She'd finished watering her flowers and was sweeping her porch now. She kept looking over at Jake's house. She was curious. Everyone was. That boy's different, she said to herself. Karen's not gonna like him one bit. She swept a little faster, like she was nervous. She'd lived here a long time. She'd seen Karen pick fights before. New people always had a hard time with her. But Jake? He didn't seem bothered. That was weird. Really weird. Mr. Thompson, the old man with the cane, was still on his porch too. He had a little radio playing soft music. He rocked back and forth in his chair, watching the street. Karen's got a new enemy, he said with a laugh. This'll be fun. He'd lived in Pinewood Heights forever. He knew Karen's tricks. She'd yell, she'd write letters, she'd call meetings. She always got her way. But something told him Jake wasn't going to play her game. Good luck, kid, he said again, quieter this time. The night got darker. Stars popped out in the sky, one by one. Pinewood Heights went quiet. The kids on bikes went home. The dogs stopped barking. Everyone was inside now, except for Karen. She was still up, writing more notes. She made a list of everything she didn't like about Jake. Truck ugly, she wrote. Door red. Attitude bad. She kept going, filling the page. She was angry. Really angry. He thinks he can ignore me, she said out loud. Me? Karen Baxter? No way. I'll fix him. I'll make him sorry. But Jake wasn't sorry. He was asleep in his little house, dreaming about something, maybe his secret. That small box sat on his table, waiting. It was just a box, right? Or was it? Maybe it held something important. Something that would change everything. Karen didn't know about the box. She didn't know about Jake's smile. She didn't know he wasn't afraid of her. She thought she'd win, like always. But this wasn't like always. The next morning came fast. The sun popped up, bright and warm again. Jake woke up early. He opened his red door and stepped outside. His truck was still there, rusty as ever. He patted it like it was a pet. Good old truck, he said. Then he looked down the street at Karen's house. Her curtains were closed, but he knew she was awake. He could almost feel her watching him. Here we go, he said to himself. That sneaky smile was back. Karen was awake, all right. She was already dressed in her pink shirt and sunglasses. She had her clipboard ready. She'd sent her letter to everyone last night. Well, she'd emailed it, because that's faster. By now, all the neighbors knew about the meeting. 6:00 p.m., it said. Be there. Karen was sure they'd all agree with her. They always did. Jake Miller's in trouble now, she said, sipping her coffee. She couldn't wait to see his face at that meeting. She'd tell everyone how bad he was. She'd make him fix his truck and his door. She'd win. Right? But Jake wasn't thinking about losing. He went back inside and grabbed that small box again. He turned it over in his hands, looking at it closely. Today's the day, he said. He put it in his pocket. Yep, it was small enough to fit, and walked back outside. He didn't look like a guy who was scared of a meeting. He looked like a guy who knew something. Something big. The neighbors started their day too. Mrs. Lopez was back with her flowers. Mr. Thompson was back with his radio. The kids on bikes zoomed by again. Everyone was talking about the meeting. Karen's mad, they said. New guys in for it? But Jake just waved at them like nothing was wrong. Morning, he called out. They waved back, confused. Why wasn't he worried? Karen stepped outside too. She saw Jake and glared at him. You'll see, she muttered. She marched off to get ready for the meeting. She had plans. Big plans. But so did Jake. And his plans? They were bigger. Much bigger. What was in that box? Why was he so calm? What was his secret? You're about to find out, but not yet. This sunny morning in Pinewood Heights was just the beginning. Things were about to get wild. From the very first day Jake moved into Pinewood Heights, Karen Baxter had it out for him. She didn't like him one bit. She didn't like his rusty truck. She didn't like his red door. And most of all, she didn't like his mailbox. To Jake, it was just a plain little thing, a metal box sitting on a wooden post. Nothing fancy, nothing big. It was gray and a little scratched up, but it worked fine. Letters went in, letters came out. That's all a mailbox needs to do, right? Well, not to Karen. Karen was the boss of the Homeowners Association, or HOA for short. She loved rules. She loved telling people what to do. And she loved her neighborhood looking perfect like a picture in a magazine. Every house had to be just right. Every yard had to be neat. Every mailbox had to be shiny and pretty. Hers was gold and fancy, with little flowers painted on it. She thought it was the best mailbox on the street. Jake's mailbox? She thought it was awful. This eyesore has to go, she snapped one day, standing in front of his house. She pointed at it with her finger, like it had personally hurt her feelings. Her voice was loud and sharp, and her face scrunched up like she'd smelled something bad. Jake was outside when she said it. He was carrying a box from his truck to his porch. He stopped and looked at her. Eyesore, he asked. He tilted his head, like he wasn't sure what she meant. Karen crossed her arms and glared at him. Yes, she said. It's ugly. It's old. It doesn't fit in Pinewood Heights. We have rules here, you know. HOA rules. And that mailbox breaks them all. Jake looked at his mailbox. It didn't seem so bad to him. But he didn't say that. He just nodded and said, okay, ma'am. Then he kept carrying his box inside. That made Karen even madder. She didn't like how calm he was. She wanted him to argue. She wanted him to fight back. But Jake didn't. He just smiled a little, quiet smile, and went about his day. That smile. It drove Karen nuts. She stomped back to her house, muttering to herself. He thinks he can ignore me, she said. Me? Karen Baxter? Oh, he's wrong. He's so wrong. She didn't know it yet, but Jake wasn't ignoring her. He was watching her. And he was planning something she'd never see coming. What was it? Oh, just wait. This is going to get good. The next day, Karen started her attack. She grabbed her clipboard, the shiny silver one she always carried, and wrote a letter. It was a nasty letter, full of angry words. Dear Mr. Miller, she wrote. Your mailbox is a disgrace. It does not meet HOA standards. Fix it now, or you will be in big trouble. She signed her name in big letters at the bottom, then marched over to Jake's house. She didn't knock nicely. She banged on his door with her fist. Boom. 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 Jake opened it, still holding a cup of coffee. He looked sleepy, like he'd just woken up. Morning, he said, rubbing his eyes. Karen shoved the letter at him. Read this, she barked. You need to fix that mailbox. Today. Jake took the letter and looked at it. He didn't say much, just okay, ma'am again. Then he shut the door. Karen stood there, her mouth open. She couldn't believe it. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just smiled. That same little smile. She turned around and stormed off, her pink shoes clicking on the sidewalk. Click, click, click. He'll see, she muttered. He'll regret this. But Jake didn't seem worried. He sat down inside and read the letter. It was mean, all right. Karen had even drawn a little picture of his mailbox with a big red X through it. He chuckled. She really hates this thing, he said to himself. Then he put the letter on his table and went back to unpacking. He didn't rush out to buy a new mailbox. He didn't call Karen to say sorry. He just kept doing what he was doing, like nothing was wrong. And that made Karen's blood boil. By lunchtime, she was back. This time, she didn't knock. She stood in Jake's front yard and yelled. "Jake Miller," she shouted. "Come out here right now." Her voice was so loud, the whole street heard it. Neighbors peeked out their windows. Kids stopped playing to watch. Jake stepped outside, still calm as ever. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Karen's face was red like a big, ripe tomato. "Your mailbox," she screamed. "It's still there. I told you to fix it. Why haven't you done it yet?" Jake shrugged. "I like it," he said. "It works fine." Karen's eyes got huge. "Works fine," she yelled. "It's a piece of junk. It's ruining my neighborhood. You'll fix this, or I'll make you regret moving here." She shook her fist at him, like she was ready to fight. The neighbors gasped. Mrs. Lopez, who lived next door, dropped her watering can. Mr. Thompson, the old man with the cane, laughed from his porch. "She's mad now," he called out. But Jake? He didn't flinch. He didn't get mad. He just nodded and said, "Okay, ma'am." Then he went back inside. Karen couldn't take it anymore. She turned to the neighbors watching. "You see this?" she shouted. "He doesn't care. He's breaking the rules. This is my street, and he's ruining it." She pointed at Jake's house like it was a monster. "I'll fix him," she said. "I'll show him who's boss." Then she marched off again, her clipboard slapping against her leg. The neighbors whispered to each other. "Poor Jake," Mrs. Lopez said. "Karen's gonna eat him alive." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe not." Inside his house, Jake wasn't scared. He wasn't sad. He sat at his little table, looking out the window. Karen was gone now, but he could still hear her yelling in his head. He smiled again, that sneaky little smile. "She's loud," he said to himself. "Real loud." Then he pulled something out of his pocket. It was a small box, taped up tight. He turned it over in his hands, like it was special. "Not yet," he whispered. "But soon." What was in that box? Why was he so calm? Karen thought he was weak, but she was wrong. Jake had a plan. A big one. The next day, things got worse. Karen sent another letter. This one was even meaner. "You ignored me," she wrote. "Your mailbox is still ugly. You have 1 day to fix it, or I'll call a meeting." She banged on his door again, boom, 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 and left the letter taped to it. Jake found it when he got home from the store. He read it and laughed. "A meeting," he said. "Okay, then." He didn't rip it up. He didn't throw it away. He kept it, like it was a prize. That night, Karen went bigger. She stood in the middle of the street and yelled at Jake's house. "You're a troublemaker," she shouted. "You don't belong here. Fix that mailbox, or else." Her face was redder than ever. Kids on bikes stopped to stare. Dogs barked. Everyone watched. Jake came to his window and looked out. He didn't say a word. He just smiled. That smile made Karen scream even louder. "Stop smiling," she yelled. "This isn't funny." But Jake thought it was. He shut the curtain and went back inside. Karen wasn't done. She wrote more letters. She banged on his door every day. She told the neighbors Jake was bad news. "He's ruining everything," she said. "That mailbox is a disgrace." Some people agreed with her. "Yeah, it's kinda ugly," they said. But others didn't care. "It's just a mailbox," Mrs. Lopez whispered. "Why's she so mad?" Mr. Thompson laughed every time. "She's losing it," he said. "New guy's driving her crazy." And he was. Karen couldn't stand Jake's calm face. She couldn't stand his quiet voice. She couldn't stand that he didn't fight back. Every time she yelled, he just said, "Okay, ma'am. Every time she sent a letter, he just smiled. It was like he didn't care. But he did care. He cared a lot. He was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. What moment? Oh, you'll see. Karen thought she was winning, but she wasn't. Jake was letting her yell. He was letting her get mad. He was planning something she'd never guess. One afternoon, Karen went too far. She grabbed her clipboard and marched to Jake's yard again. "I've had it," she shouted. "You're a problem. That mailbox is a problem. I'm calling the HOA tomorrow. We'll make you fix it." Her voice echoed down the street. Jake stepped outside, hands in his pockets. "Okay, ma'am," he said. Karen's face turned purple. "Stop saying that," she screamed. "You're not listening. You're mocking me." Jake shook his head. "No, ma'am," he said. "I hear you." Then he smiled again. Karen lost it. She threw her clipboard on the ground. It hit the grass with a thud. "You'll see," she yelled. "You'll regret this. I'm in charge here." She turned and ran back to her house, slamming her door. Boom. The neighbors watched, wide-eyed. "She's nuts," a kid on a bike said. Mrs. Lopez nodded. "Poor Jake," she said again. But Jake didn't look poor. He picked up Karen's clipboard and looked at it. "Huh," he said. Then he took it inside. That night, Karen planned her big move. She sat at her desk, writing emails to the HOA. "Meeting tomorrow," she typed. "Jake Miller is breaking rules. We need to stop him." She smiled, thinking she'd win. But Jake? He was smiling too. He sat in his house, holding that small box again. "Tomorrow," he said to himself. That's the day. What was he up to? Why wasn't he scared? Karen thought she had him trapped, but she didn't. Something big was coming. Something wild. Keep listening, this is just the start. From day one, Karen had it out for Jake. His mailbox wasn't fancy enough for her precious HOA rules. It was just a plain metal box on a wooden post, nothing special. But to Karen, it was an insult. "This eyesore has to go," she snapped, pointing at it like it had personally offended her. She sent Jake nasty letters, banged on his door, and even yelled at him in front of the whole street. "You'll fix this, or I'll make you regret moving here," she shouted one day, her face red as a tomato. Jake just nodded and said, "Okay, ma'am." He didn't argue. He didn't yell back. He just smiled. And that smile, it drove Karen nuts. She didn't know he was already planning something she'd never see coming. What was Jake up to? Keep listening. Karen didn't stop with just one yell. Oh no, she kept going. The next morning, she was back at it. She stood on her porch, sipping her coffee, and stared at Jake's house. That mailbox was still there, sitting quietly in his yard. It hadn't changed. It was still plain. Still gray. Still scratched up. Karen's eyes narrowed. He didn't listen, she muttered to herself. He didn't fix it. She put her coffee down clink, and grabbed her clipboard again. She had more ideas. More ways to make Jake obey. She wrote another letter. This one was longer. Meaner. "Jake Miller," she scratched onto the paper, "you are breaking the rules. Your mailbox is ugly. It's old. It's a problem. You have 2 days to get a new one, or I'll tell everyone in the HOA. We'll fine you. We'll make you sorry." She drew a big angry face at the bottom, with sharp teeth and squinty eyes. Then she marched over to Jake's house again. The sun was bright, and the street was quiet except for Karen's loud steps. Click, click, click went her pink shoes. Jake was outside this time, watering some flowers he'd just planted. They were little yellow ones, popping up near his porch. He held a green watering can and hummed a little song. He looked happy. Calm. Like nothing was wrong. Karen stomped right up to him and shoved the letter in his face. "Here," she barked. "Read it. Fix that mailbox, or else." Jake stopped watering and took the letter. Water dripped from the can onto his shoes, but he didn't care. He looked at the paper, then at Karen. "Okay, ma'am," he said. That smile came back small, sneaky, quiet. Karen's face turned redder than before. "Stop saying that," she yelled. "You're not taking me seriously. I'm the HOA president. I make the rules." She pointed at the mailbox again, her finger shaking. "That thing is garbage. Get rid of it." Jake nodded, real slow. "I hear you," he said. "I'll think about it." Then he turned back to his flowers and kept watering. Drip, drip, drip. Karen stood there, huffing and puffing. She couldn't believe it. He didn't fight. He didn't yell. He just watered his flowers. Like she wasn't even there. She spun around and stormed off. "You'll see," she shouted over her shoulder. 2 days, Jake Miller. 2 days. The neighbors heard her again. Mrs. Lopez was sweeping her porch. She stopped and watched Karen go. "Oh boy," she said softly. "She's really mad now." Mr. Thompson, sitting on his porch with his cane, laughed out loud. "New guy's got her twisted up," he called. "This is better than TV." Kids on bikes slowed down to look. Everyone knew something was happening. Karen versus Jake. And Jake? He wasn't backing down. Inside his house, Jake put the letter on his table. He had a little pile of them now, 3 nasty notes from Karen, all about that mailbox. He sat down and looked at them. One said, "Fix it now." Another said, "You're in trouble." This new one said, 2 days. He chuckled. "She's busy," he said to himself. Then he leaned back in his chair and pulled that small box out of his pocket again. It was still taped up, still secret. He tapped it with his fingers. Tap, tap, tap. "Not yet," he whispered. But soon. What was in there? Why was he waiting? Karen thought he was lazy or scared, but she was so wrong. The next day, Karen got louder. She didn't just write letters this time. She grabbed a megaphone, a big, loudspeaker thing from her garage. She stood in her yard and turned it on. Bzzzt. The sound crackled through the street. "Jake Miller," she shouted into it. Her voice boomed, so loud it shook the windows. "Your mailbox is a disgrace. Fix it now, or the HOA will make you pay." Kids covered their ears. Dogs barked like crazy. Mrs. Lopez dropped her broom and ran inside. Mr. Thompson just laughed harder. "She's lost it," he said. Jake heard it too. He was in his kitchen, making a sandwich. Peanut butter and jelly, his favorite. He peeked out the window and saw Karen with her megaphone. She was waving it around, yelling his name over and over. "Jake Miller! Jake Miller! Fix that mailbox!" He took a bite of his sandwich and watched her. "Wow," he said, his mouth full. "She's got a big voice." He didn't run outside. He didn't yell back. He finished his sandwich, then went to his table and sat down. That smile was still there. That sneaky little smile. Karen kept going. She marched up and down the street with her megaphone. "He's breaking the rules," she shouted. "He doesn't care. We can't let him stay like this." Some neighbors nodded. "She's right," they said. "That mailbox is kinda ugly." But others rolled their eyes. "It's not a big deal," they whispered. "Why's she so loud?" Karen didn't care what they thought. She wanted Jake to hear her. She wanted him to be scared. But he wasn't. He was inside, calm as ever, holding that little box. By afternoon, Karen tried something new. She called her friend Linda from the HOA. "Linda," she said into her phone. "We need to do something about Jake. His mailbox is awful, and he won't listen." Linda's voice was quiet on the other end. "Okay, Karen," she said. "What do you want?" Karen grinned. "A meeting," she said. "Tomorrow night? We'll tell everyone how bad he is. They'll vote to make him fix it." Linda sighed. "Fine," she said. "I'll send the email." Karen hung up and clapped her hands. "Perfect," she said. "He's done for." She wrote the email herself, just to be sure. "Dear Pinewood Heights," it said. "Jake Miller is a problem. His mailbox breaks our rules. Come to the meeting tomorrow at 6 p.m. We'll stop him." She hit send and leaned back in her chair. He'll regret this, she said. He'll wish he'd listened to me. She pictured Jake at the meeting, all nervous and sad, begging for forgiveness. She smiled a big, mean smile. Oh, she couldn't wait. But Jake wasn't nervous. He got the email too. It went to everyone. He read it on his phone while sitting on his porch. Meeting tomorrow, he said out loud. Huh. He didn't frown. He didn't panic. He smiled. That same sneaky smile. Mrs. Lopez saw him and walked over. Karen's calling a meeting, she said. She's mad about your mailbox. You okay? Jake nodded. I'm fine, he said. Thanks for checking. Mrs. Lopez frowned. She's tough, she said. Be careful. Jake's smile got bigger. I will, he said. But he didn't look worried. Not one bit. That night, Karen kept pushing. She banged on Jake's door again. Boom. 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 He opened it, holding a glass of water. Yes, ma'am, he said. Karen glared at him. Tomorrow's the meeting, she snapped. You're in big trouble now. Everyone's against you. Jake tilted his head. Okay, ma'am, he said. Karen's face went purple. Stop that, she yelled. You're mocking me. You'll see what happens. She turned and stomped off. Jake shut the door and laughed. She's fun, he said to himself. The neighbors were buzzing now. Meeting tomorrow, they said. Karen's gonna win. Some thought Jake should just give up. Fix the mailbox, they said. It's easier. But others weren't so sure. He's too calm, Mr. Thompson said. Something's up. And he was right. Jake wasn't giving up. He wasn't scared. He was ready. Ready for what? Oh, it's coming. Karen thought she had him beat, but Jake had a secret. A big one. And that smile. It meant trouble for her. The next morning, Karen was all over the place. She put up signs. Meeting tonight, they said. Stop Jake Miller. She taped them to trees, to mailboxes everywhere but Jake's house. She wanted him to feel alone. She wanted him to feel small. But Jake didn't. He saw the signs and chuckled. Busy lady, he said. He watered his flowers again, humming that same little song. The yellow petals glowed in the sun. He liked them. He liked his mailbox too. And he wasn't changing either, not yet. Karen saw him watering and lost it again. She grabbed her megaphone. Jake Miller, she boomed. You're done. Tonight, you're finished. Her voice echoed loud and clear. Jake waved at her. See you there, he called back. Karen dropped the megaphone. It hit the ground with a thud. What? She yelled. See me there. She couldn't believe it. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He was coming to her meeting. That made her mad and a little nervous. Inside, Jake was getting ready. He pulled that small box out again. He opened it just a crack and peeked inside. Tonight, he said. He shut it fast and put it back in his pocket. What was in there? Why was it so special? Karen had no idea. She thought she was in charge. She thought she'd win. But Jake's smile said something else. Something big was coming. Something she'd never expect. The tension was thick now. The fight was on. And Jake? He was just getting started. Weeks went by in Pinewood Heights, and Karen Baxter got bolder every day. She wasn't done with Jake Miller, not even close. She'd already yelled at him about his mailbox, sent him nasty letters, and called a big HOA meeting to make him fix it. But Jake didn't change a thing. His mailbox stayed the same, plain, gray, and scratched up. His red door didn't get painted. His rusty truck still sat in the driveway. And that made Karen madder than ever. Every morning, she'd grab her shiny silver clipboard and march right up to Jake's yard. She'd stand there, staring at everything, looking for something, anything to complain about. One day, she pointed at his grass. Too tall, she snapped, scribbling on her paper. Half an inch over the limit. That's a violation. The grass looked fine to everyone else, green and neat, but not to Karen. She had rules. Big rules. And Jake wasn't following them. She wrote it down, Violation number 4, grass too tall. Then she banged on his door, boom, 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 and shoved a note under it when he didn't answer fast enough. Jake found the note later. Fix your grass, it said in big, angry letters. He read it and chuckled. Half an inch, he said to himself. Really? He didn't grab a lawnmower. He didn't rush outside to cut it. He just tossed the note on his table with the others. By now, he had a little stack letters about his mailbox, his truck, his door, and now his grass. Karen was busy, all right. But Jake? He stayed calm. Too calm. Like he knew something she didn't. Karen didn't stop there. She got nosier. She'd peek over Jake's fence, checking his backyard. One time, she saw a birdhouse he'd hung on a tree. It was small and wooden, painted blue. That's not allowed, she yelled, even though no one was around to hear her. She wrote it down, violation number 5, ugly birdhouse. She taped a note to his gate that night. Take it down, it said. Jake found it in the morning and smiled that sneaky little smile he always had. A birdhouse, he said. Wow. He left it up. The birds liked it, and so did he. Day after day, Karen kept coming. She'd march up with her clipboard, her pink shoes clicking loud on the sidewalk. Click, click, click. She'd scribble more violations. His porch light was too dim, his trash can was out too early, his flowers were the wrong color. She'd yell through his window sometimes. Jake Miller, she'd shout. You're ruining my neighborhood. Jake would peek out, wave, and say, okay, ma'am. That drove her crazy. He never argued. He never got mad. He just smiled. And Karen hated that smile more than anything. The neighbors watched it all. Mrs. Lopez, who lived next door, would shake her head. She won't stop, she'd say, watering her own flowers. Mr. Thompson, the old man with the cane, would laugh from his porch. She's like a dog with a bone, he'd call out. The kids on bikes started counting how many times Karen showed up. That's 10 this week, they'd say, giggling. Everyone knew Karen was picking on Jake. But Jake didn't seem to mind. He'd water his yellow flowers, fix his truck, or sit on his porch with a glass of water. Calm. Quiet. Smiling. Then one night, it happened. The big moment. Jake was asleep in his little house, dreaming about something, maybe his secret. The clock said 2 a.m. Everything was dark and still. Suddenly, crash. A loud noise ripped through the quiet. Jake's eyes popped open. He sat up fast, his heart thumping. What was that? He said. He jumped out of bed, pulled on his shoes, and ran outside. The moon was bright, lighting up his yard. And there it was, his mailbox, smashed to bits. Pieces of metal and wood were scattered everywhere. The gray box was crumpled, the wooden post snapped in half. Letters he'd gotten that day, bills and a postcard, were stuck in the grass. Jake stared at the mess. His mailbox was gone. Destroyed. And who was standing there, right in the middle of it? Karen Baxter. She held a baseball bat in her hands, her face glowing with a smug grin. She looked proud, like she'd just won a prize. Problem solved, she said, brushing her hands together like it was no big deal. She dropped the bat in the dirt and crossed her arms. Jake looked at the broken mailbox, then at her. His hair was messy from sleep, and his pajamas were wrinkled. But his eyes? They were sharp. Clear. He didn't yell. He didn't run at her. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, and said, "You sure about that?" His voice was quiet, too quiet. Calm, too calm. Karen laughed, loud and mean. "Oh, I'm sure," she said. "No more ugly mailbox. Now you have to get a new one. A fancy one. HOA rules." She turned and walked away, her laugh echoing down the street. She thought she'd won. She thought it was over. But here's the thing, Jake wasn't mad. He wasn't upset. He stood there, looking at the mess, and that sneaky smile crept back onto his face. "Okay," he whispered to himself. He wasn't yelling or crying like Karen expected. He was ready. Ready for what? Oh, you're gonna love this next part. Karen thought she'd beaten him, but she didn't know what Jake knew. She didn't see what he saw. Something big was coming, and she just made it happen faster. Jake didn't go back to bed. He went inside, grabbed a flashlight, and came back out. He shined it on the broken pieces, metal bits, wood chunks, torn letters. He bent down and picked up a little screw that used to hold the mailbox together. He turned it over in his fingers, thinking. "She's bold," he said softly. Then he stood up and looked at Karen's house. Her lights were off now. She was probably asleep, dreaming of her big victory. But Jake wasn't sleeping. He was awake. And he was planning. The next morning, the neighbors saw it. "Whoa," the kids on bikes shouted, stopping to stare. "His mailbox is gone." Mrs. Lopez came out with her coffee and gasped. "Oh no," she said. "Karen went too far." Mr. Thompson hobbled over with his cane. "She smashed it," he said, laughing. "That lady's wild." Word spread fast. By noon, everyone in Pinewood Heights knew Karen had wrecked Jake's mailbox. Some cheered. "Good for her," they said. "It was ugly." But others frowned. "That's mean," they whispered. "He didn't hurt anyone." Karen strutted out of her house like a queen. She wore her big sunglasses and a bright pink shirt. She saw the neighbors looking and smiled. "See," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I fixed it. No more problem." She walked over to Jake's yard, expecting to see him sad or scared. But Jake wasn't there. His porch was empty. His truck was gone too. "Where is he?" Karen muttered. She didn't like that. She wanted to see him give up. She wanted to win in front of everyone. Jake wasn't gone for long. His rusty truck rumbled back into the driveway an hour later. He hopped out, carrying a little bag from the store. The neighbors watched, curious. "What's he got?" the kids whispered. Karen marched over, ready to yell again. "You're too late," she snapped. "Your mailbox is gone. Get a new one now." Jake set the bag down and looked at her. "Okay, ma'am," he said. That smile was back. Karen's grin faded a little. "What's so funny?" she asked. Jake didn't answer. He just picked up his bag and went inside. That's when the first small revelation came. Jake opened the bag and pulled out a camera. A tiny little camera, black and shiny. He held it up and checked it. "Still works," he said to himself. Then he smiled bigger. See, Jake had a secret. That camera? It wasn't new. He'd put it up days ago, hidden in a tree by his mailbox. It was watching everything. And last night? It caught Karen smashing his mailbox with that bat. Every swing. Every laugh. Every word. Jake had it all on video. He didn't tell anyone yet. He didn't run out and show Karen. He kept it quiet, saving it for the right time. But that wasn't all. He pulled that small taped-up box out of his pocket again. He opened it just a peek and nodded. "Soon," he said. What was in there? Another secret? Something even bigger? Karen didn't know about the camera. She didn't know about the box. She thought she was winning, but Jake was steps ahead. The day went on, and Karen got cocky. She called Linda again. "I did it," she bragged. "Smashed his mailbox. He's got nothing now." Linda sounded worried. Karen," she said, "are you sure that's okay?" Karen laughed. "Of course it's okay. I'm the HOA president. I make the rules." She hung up and danced around her kitchen. She was so happy. So proud. But Jake? He was happy too. Happier than her. That night, Jake watched the video on his phone. Karen's bat swinging whack. The mailbox falling crash. Her laughing ha ha ha. He saved it and put his phone down. "Gotcha," he whispered. He wasn't mad about his mailbox anymore. He was excited. Something was coming. Something big. Karen thought she'd solved her problem, but she'd just made a bigger one for herself. What would Jake do with that video? What was in that box? Oh, it's getting good now. Stick around, you won't believe what's next. The next morning in Pinewood Heights started like any other day. The sun popped up, bright and warm, shining over the little houses. Birds chirped in the trees. Kids got ready to ride their bikes. Everything seemed normal until it wasn't. Karen Baxter woke up with a big stretch and a smile. She was proud of herself. Last night, she'd smashed Jake Miller's mailbox with her baseball bat. Crash. She could still hear it in her head. She thought she'd won. No more ugly mailbox. No more problem. She'd show Jake who was boss. She put on her pink shirt and big sunglasses, ready to strut outside and enjoy her victory. But when she opened her curtains, her smile disappeared fast. Police cars lined the street, 3 of them. Their red and blue lights flashed, spinning round and round. Sirens were off, but the lights made everything look wild. Neighbors peeked out their windows, pulling curtains aside. Some stepped onto their porches, whispering to each other. "What's going on?" they said. "Why are the cops here?" Kids stopped playing, staring with big eyes. Mrs. Lopez dropped her coffee mug clink, and ran to her fence. Mr. Thompson hobbled out with his cane, squinting. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. Something big was happening. Karen's heart started thumping. She didn't like this. Not one bit. She pushed her door open and marched outside, her pink shoes clicking loud. Click, click, click. She wanted to know what was up. She saw the police cars parked right by Jake's house. And there he was, Jake Miller, standing in his yard, talking to a police officer. The officer was tall, with a blue uniform and a shiny badge. He held a little notebook, writing stuff down. Jake pointed at the smashed mailbox, the mess of metal and wood still scattered in the grass. His voice was calm, quiet, like always. Karen couldn't hear what he said, but she didn't care. She strutted right over, ready to tell her side. "Hey," she shouted, waving her arms. "What's this about? That mailbox was ugly. I fixed it." She stood tall, hands on her hips, thinking she'd explain everything. The neighbors watched, holding their breath. The officer turned to her, his face serious. "Ma'am," he said, "you need to calm down." Karen's eyes got wide. "Calm down," she yelled. "I'm Karen Baxter. I run the HOA. I'm in charge here." The officer didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just looked at her and said, "Ma'am, you're under arrest." "What?" Karen screeched. Her voice was so loud, it echoed down the street. Dogs barked. Birds flew out of the trees. "Arrest," she screamed. "For a stupid mailbox." Her face turned red like a big, ripe tomato. She waved her hands, stomping her feet. "This is crazy. It's just a dumb box. I did everyone a favor." The neighbors gasped. Mrs. Lopez covered her mouth. Mr. Thompson laughed so hard he almost dropped his cane. The kids on bikes whispered, "Whoa, she's in trouble." Karen didn't get it. She thought she was right. She thought she'd win. But she was so wrong. That's when Jake stepped forward. He'd been quiet, letting the officer talk. Now it was his turn. He looked at Karen, calm as ever, and dropped the bomb. "That wasn't just my mailbox," he said. His voice was soft, but every word hit hard. "It's federal property. And I've got you on camera." Yep, Jake had a secret, a big one. He'd hidden a tiny security camera in the tree by his mailbox days ago. It was small, black, and sneaky, tucked between the leaves where no one could see it. That camera recorded everything last night. Every swing of Karen's bat whack. Every laugh, ha ha ha. Every word, problem solved. It caught it all. Destroying a mailbox? That's not just mean. It's a crime, a real, big crime. Karen's jaw dropped. Her mouth hung open like a fish. "Camera," she squeaked. "Federal property." She didn't understand. She blinked fast, her sunglasses sliding down her nose. The officer nodded. "That's right," he said. "Mailboxes belong to the post office. You can't smash them. It's against the law. And we've got the video." He held up a little screen, a tablet thing, and pressed play. There it was, Karen in the moonlight, swinging her bat. Whack. Crash. "Problem solved," her voice said, loud and clear. The neighbors leaned in, watching. "Oh no," Mrs. Lopez whispered. "She's done for." Mr. Thompson clapped. "Ha! Caught her." Karen's face went from red to white. No, she yelled. That's not fair. He tricked me. That mailbox was ugly. I was helping. She pointed at Jake, shaking. You set me up. Jake shook his head. No, ma'am, he said. You smashed it? I just watched. That sneaky smile was back, small, quiet, but oh so powerful. Karen screeched again. This is ridiculous. I'm the HOA president. You can't arrest me. But the officer didn't care. He pulled out handcuffs, shiny silver ones, and stepped toward her. Hands behind your back, ma'am, he said. The neighbors couldn't believe it. She's going to jail, the kids shouted, jumping up and down. For a mailbox. Mrs. Lopez shook her head. She went too far, she said. Mr. Thompson grinned. Told you he had something up his sleeve. Karen tried to run, but another officer, a lady with short hair, grabbed her arm. Not so fast, she said. Click. The handcuff snapped shut. Karen wiggled and yelled. Let me go. This is a mistake. I'm important. But the officers didn't listen. They walked her to the police car, her pink shoes dragging on the ground. Jake watched it all, hands in his pockets. He didn't cheer. He didn't laugh. He just stood there, calm and cool. The officer with the notebook turned to him. Good job, Mr. Miller, he said. That video makes it easy. She's in big trouble now. Jake nodded. Thanks, he said. Just wanted to keep things right. The officer wrote more notes, then walked back to the car. Karen was inside now, banging on the window. You'll pay for this, Jake, she shouted, her voice muffled. I'll get you. But no one believed her. She wasn't the queen anymore. That's when the big reveal got even bigger. Jake turned to the neighbors, who were all staring at him. There's more, he said. He pulled that small, taped-up box out of his pocket, the one he'd been hiding all this time. He held it up, and everyone got quiet. What's that? A kid on a bike asked. Mrs. Lopez stepped closer. Yeah, Jake, she said. What's in there? Jake smiled, not the sneaky smile this time, but a real one. Take a look, he said. He peeled off the tape and opened the box. Inside was a badge. A shiny gold badge with words on it. Federal Postal Inspector, it said. The neighbors gasped again. What? Mr. Thompson yelled. He's a cop. Jake nodded. Not a cop, he said. I work for the post office. I make sure mail stuff is safe. Mailboxes, letters, all of it. The kids' eyes got huge. Whoa, they said. You're like a secret agent. Jake laughed. Kinda, he said. I moved here to check things out. Heard some complaints about mail problems. Didn't expect this, though. He pointed at the smashed mailbox. Karen heard it from the police car. Her window was cracked open just enough. Postal inspector, she screeched. No way. She banged on the glass harder. He tricked me. He's a liar. But the officers shut the door tight. Jake wasn't lying. He'd been watching Karen for weeks, not just her, but the whole neighborhood. His job was to protect the mail. And Karen? She'd broken a big rule. A federal rule. Smashing a mailbox wasn't just an HOA fight, it was a crime against the government. And Jake had the proof. The neighbors crowded around him now. You're a hero, Mrs. Lopez said, clapping. She's been bossing us around forever. Mr. Thompson nodded. Knew you were different, kid, he said. Smart move with that camera. The kids cheered. Take her away, they shouted, pointing at the police car. Karen glared out the window, her sunglasses crooked. She couldn't talk anymore, just glare. The officers started the car, and the lights flashed again. They drove off, taking Karen with them. Her yells faded away. Jake picked up a piece of his broken mailbox and looked at it. Guess I need a new one now, he said. The neighbors laughed. Make it fancy, a kid yelled. No, Jake said, grinning. Just something simple. That's me. He wasn't mad. He wasn't gloating. He'd done his job. Karen thought she'd messed with some regular guy, but she'd messed with the wrong person. Jake wasn't just the new guy on the block. He was a postal inspector, a quiet hero with a badge and a plan. The street buzzed with talk. "She's gone," people said. Jake stopped her. Kids ran around, pretending to be cops. Mrs. Lopez brought Jake a plate of cookies. "You're amazing," she said. Mr. Thompson tipped his hat. "Best show I've seen in years," he said. Jake took the cookies and thanked them. "Just doing my job," he said. But it was more than that. He'd turned Karen's big win into her big fall. And that camera? That badge? They were the surprises she never saw coming. The police cars were gone now. The street got quiet again. Jake went back inside, badge in his pocket. He'd won not with yelling or fighting, but with smarts. Karen's jaw-dropping moment was his big reveal. She had no idea who she'd messed with. And now? She was on her way to jail, all because of a stupid mailbox. Oh, what a morning. What a twist. You're gonna love what happens next. Justice is just getting started. The police cars were parked right in front of Jake Miller's house in Pinewood Heights. Their lights flashed red and blue, spinning round and round. Karen Baxter stood there, her hands behind her back, yelling her head off. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "I'm the HOA president. You can't do this to me." Her face was red, and her big sunglasses were crooked on her nose. But the cops didn't care. They didn't even look at her funny. The tall officer with the shiny badge just snapped the handcuffs on her wrists. Click, click. The cold metal locked tight, and Karen wiggled like a fish on a hook. "Let me go," she screamed. "I didn't do anything wrong." But the lady officer with short hair shook her head. "You smashed a mailbox, ma'am," she said. "That's a crime." Karen's eyes got huge. "A crime," she yelled. "It was ugly. I was helping." She stomped her pink shoes on the ground, but the cops didn't listen. They grabbed her arms, one on each side, and started walking her to the police car. Her feet dragged a little, kicking up dirt. "You'll be sorry," she shouted. "I'm important. I'm in charge." The neighbors watched it all from their yards and porches. Nobody helped Karen. Nobody said, "Stop." Instead, they clapped. Clap, clap, clap. Mrs. Lopez, who lived next door to Jake, smiled big and clapped loudest. "Good riddance," she called out. Mr. Thompson, the old man with the cane, banged his hand on his porch railing. "Take her away," he cheered. The kids on bikes pumped their fists in the air. "Yeah," they shouted. "She's gone." Jake stood by his smashed mailbox, the pile of metal and wood, and waved goodbye to her. Not a mean wave, just a little one. "See ya," he said quietly. That sneaky smile was still on his face. The police car door opened with a creak. The officers pushed Karen inside gently, but firm. She kept yelling, even as they shut the door. "This is a mistake. I'm the HOA president." Her voice was muffled now, coming through the glass. The neighbors didn't care. They kept clapping as the car started up. Vroom. The engine roared, and the lights flashed one more time. Then the cops drove off, taking Karen down the street and out of sight. Her yells got softer and softer until they were gone. Pinewood Heights was quiet again except for the clapping. That went on for a while. Jake turned to the crowd. Everyone was looking at him now: Mrs. Lopez, Mr. Thompson, the kids, even the dogs wagging their tails. "Thanks, everyone," he said. His voice was calm, like always. "Just doing my job." Turns out, he wasn't just some random guy who moved in with a rusty truck and a red door. Oh no. He was a federal postal inspector, a big deal. He worked for the post office, making sure mail stuff stayed safe. Mailboxes, letters, packages, all of it. And Karen? She'd broken the law by smashing his mailbox. Jake knew that. He wasn't afraid to use it. He'd caught her on camera, and now she was paying the price. The neighbors crowded around him. "You're awesome," a kid with a red cap said, holding up his bike. "You got her." Mrs. Lopez hugged him quick. "We've been scared of her forever," she said. "She bossed us all around." "No more." Mr. Thompson hobbled over, leaning on his cane. "Knew you were smart, kid," he said. "Letting her dig her own hole like that. Genius." Jake laughed a soft, happy laugh. "She did it to herself," he said. I just waited. And boy, did she fall deep. Karen thought she was the queen, but Jake showed her she wasn't. Later that day, things started to change. The HOA the group Karen used to run had to pick a new leader. They couldn't have a president in handcuffs, right? So, the neighbors got together in Mrs. Lopez's backyard. It was a sunny afternoon, and she made lemonade for everyone. The kids ran around, sipping from plastic cups. The grown UPS sat in chairs, talking about what happened. Karen's gone, Mr. Thompson said, sipping his drink. Good thing, too. She was mean. Everyone nodded. Who's gonna take her place? A lady with glasses asked. Mrs. Lopez raised her hand. I will, she said. I'll be nice. No yelling. No smashing stuff. The neighbors cheered. Yeah, they said. You're perfect. Mr. Thompson banged his cane on the ground. Better than Karen any day, he said. They voted right, their hands up in the air, and Mrs. Lopez won. She was the new HOA president. No more nasty letters. No more clipboard marches. Just lemonade and smiles. Everyone liked that a lot better. Jake wasn't at the meeting. He was busy fixing his yard. His mailbox was still a mess, bits of metal and wood all over. He couldn't leave it like that. So, he drove his rusty truck to the store and came back with a new one. It wasn't fancy like Karen's gold one with painted flowers. Nope. It was simple, shiny silver, strong, and legal. He dug a hole with a shovel, stuck a new wooden post in, and screwed the mailbox on top. Tap, tap, tap went his hammer. When he was done, it stood straight and proud. There, he said, wiping sweat off his forehead. Karen proof. The kids on bikes rode by and saw it. Cool, they shouted. No more smashing. Jake waved at them. Yep, he said. All good now. Mrs. Lopez walked over with a glass of lemonade for him. Looks nice, she said. Way better than the old one. Jake took the drink and sipped it. Thanks, he said. Just needed something that works. She smiled. You're a good neighbor, Jake, she said. We're lucky you moved here. Jake nodded. Happy to be here, he said. And he meant it. Word spread fast about what happened. By dinner time, everyone in Pinewood Heights knew the story. Karen's in jail, they said. Jake's a hero. Kids told their friends. Grown UPS talked over fences. Even the dogs seemed to bark it out, woof, woof. People stopped messing with Jake after that. Before, some thought he was just a quiet guy with a junky truck. Now, they knew he was tough. Smart. Not afraid. If you tried to push him, he'd push back, but not with yelling or fighting. With brains. With the law. Karen learned that the hard way. The next day, Jake's phone buzzed. It was his boss from the post office, a lady named Ms. Carter. Good work, Jake, she said. Caught her on video, huh? Smart move. Jake leaned back in his chair. Thanks, he said. She made it easy. Ms. Carter laughed. Well, you cleaned up Pinewood Heights, she said. No more mail trouble there. What's next? Jake looked out his window at his new mailbox. Just staying here, he said. It's a nice place. Ms. Carter said, okay, Inspector. Call if you need me. Then she hung up. Jake liked that inspector. It was his job, but he didn't brag about it. He didn't need to shout or show off. He just did what was right. Karen, though. She was the opposite. She'd yelled and bossed and smashed, thinking she'd win. But she didn't. She dug her own hole, step by step, and Jake let her fall right in. Boy, did she fall deep. 1 minute, she was the HOA queen, strutting around with her clipboard. The next? She was in a police car, yelling through a window. What a drop. A week later, things were back to normal but better. The street was peaceful. Kids rode bikes. Dogs chased balls. Mrs. Lopez made new HOA rules easy ones, like be nice and help each other. No one complained about Jake's truck or his red door anymore. They didn't care about his grass or his mailbox. They liked him. He'd saved them from Karen's mean ways without even raising his voice. That was his power, quiet, strong, smart. One afternoon, Mr. Thompson hobbled over to Jake's porch. "Got a gift for you," he said. He held out a little wooden sign. It said, "Best neighbor ever," carved in big letters. Jake took it and smiled. "Thanks," he said. "Don't need it, though." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "Take it," he said. "You earned it." Jake hung it by his door not to brag, but because it was nice. The red door looked even better with it. Karen didn't come back. Word got around she was in big trouble, not just for the mailbox, but for other stuff too. Turns out, she'd been mean to mail carriers before, yelling at them and breaking rules. Jake's video started it all, and now she had to face the law. "She's gone for good," Mrs. Lopez said one day, sipping tea with Jake. "Thanks to you." Jake shrugged. "She did it," he said. "I just watched." Mrs. Lopez laughed. "You're funny," she said. "But you're the best." Pinewood Heights was happy now. No more Karen. No more fights. Jake's new mailbox stood tall, shiny and strong. His truck rumbled in the driveway. His yellow flowers bloomed bright. He didn't need to shout or fight, he'd won his way. Justice was served, quiet and sure. Karen fell deep, and Jake? He stood tall. The end. Not quite. Life went on, but it was better. Way better. So here's the thing, friends, sometimes the quiet ones are the strongest. That's what this whole crazy story about Jake and Karen teaches us. Karen Baxter thought she was the big boss of Pinewood Heights. She strutted around with her clipboard and her pink shoes, yelling at everyone. She thought she could push Jake Miller around because he didn't look like much. Just a guy with a rusty truck, a red door, and a plain old mailbox. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He just smiled that sneaky little smile and said, "Okay, ma'am." Karen thought that meant he was weak. She thought he was nothing. But looks? They don't tell the whole story. Nope, not even close. See, Jake was quiet, but he was smart. Really smart. Karen didn't know that. She didn't know he was a federal postal inspector with a badge in his pocket. She didn't know he had a camera hidden in his tree, watching everything she did. She thought she could smash his mailbox with her baseball bat and win. "Problem solved," she said, laughing like she'd beat him. But Jake? He wasn't mad. He wasn't scared. He was ready. He let her yell. He let her write her nasty letters. He let her march around with her megaphone. And then bam, he dropped the big surprise. That mailbox wasn't just his. It was federal property. Smashing it was a crime. And he had it all on video. Karen's jaw dropped, and off she went in a police car, yelling all the way. That's the cool part, right? Jake didn't need to be loud to be strong. He didn't need to wave his fists or scream in her face. He used his brain. He waited for the right moment. And when it came, he showed everyone who he really was. Not just some new guy on the block, but a hero who protected the neighborhood. Karen fell deep into her own hole, and Jake stood tall. So, next time someone tries to boss you around like a bully at school or a mean kid on the playground, remember Jake. You don't have to yell back. You don't have to cry. You can be quiet and strong, just like him. Maybe even keep a camera handy. You never know when it'll come in clutch. Let's think about that for a second. Karen saw Jake's truck and thought, he's nothing. She saw his plain mailbox and thought, easy target. She judged him by what he looked like on the outside. But inside? Jake was a powerhouse. He knew stuff, law stuff, mail stuff, smart stuff. He had a plan all along. That's a big lesson for us. People might look at you and think they know you. Maybe they see your old sneakers or your messy hair and think, oh, they're not tough. But they don't know what's in your head. They don't know what you can do. You've got your own power, just like Jake. It's not about how loud you are or how fancy you look. It's about what you've got inside. Think about your own life. Have you ever met a Karen? Maybe not someone with a clipboard and a baseball bat, but someone who tries to push you down? A kid who says mean stuff? A teacher who doesn't listen? I bet you have. We all have. Sometimes those people seem big and scary, like they're in charge of everything. But Jake shows us they're not. Karen thought she ruled Pinewood Heights. She thought she could do whatever she wanted. But one quiet guy with a camera flipped her whole world upside down. You can do that too, not with a camera, maybe, but with your own way. Be patient. Be smart. Be you. That's how you win. And what about Karen? Did she get what she deserved? Oh, I think so. She was mean. She yelled at Jake for weeks about his mailbox, his grass, his truck. She wrote nasty letters and banged on his door. She even smashed his stuff with a bat. That's not okay. She thought she was above everyone, like a queen on a throne. But queens can fall, and Karen fell hard. The cops took her away, and the neighbors cheered. She didn't just lose her HOA job, she lost her power. Now she's in trouble with the law, all because she couldn't leave Jake alone. That's what happens when you push too far. You dig your own hole, and down you go. Jake didn't dig that hole for her. He didn't set a trap. He just watched her do it herself. That's the funny part. Karen thought she was so clever, smashing that mailbox in the middle of the night. Ha, she said. I fixed it. But every swing of that bat was another shovel digging deeper. Jake didn't have to fight her. He let her keep going until oops, she was stuck. That's a cool trick, right? Letting the mean ones trip over their own feet. You can try that too. If someone's being a bully, sometimes you just step back and let them mess up. They'll figure it out eventually, or someone else will, like the cops did for Karen. Now, let's talk about you. Yeah, you. The kid reading this right now. Maybe you're sitting at home, or maybe you're at school sneaking the story under your desk. Hi there. You're awesome, you know that. You don't have to be the loudest kid in the room to be strong. You don't have to have the coolest toys or the best clothes. Jake didn't. His truck was rusty. His mailbox was plain. But he was the toughest guy in Pinewood Heights because he was smart and brave. You've got that in you too. Maybe you're good at drawing. Maybe you're great at helping your friends. Maybe you know how to wait for the right time to say something. That's your power. Hold on to it. What if you meet a Karen someday? Maybe it's a bossy kid who says, "You can't play with us." Or maybe it's someone who laughs at your backpack. What do you do? Well, think about Jake. He didn't yell back at Karen. He didn't run away. He stayed calm and figured it out. You can do that. Smile a little, maybe not sneaky like Jake, but friendly. Say, okay, and keep doing your thing. Bullies hate that. They want you to get mad or sad. But if you stay cool, they don't know what to do. And who knows? Maybe you've got a camera of your own, like a teacher you can tell, or a friend who's got your back. Use it when you need it. This story's over, but it's not really the end. Jake's still out there in Pinewood Heights, watering his yellow flowers and driving his rusty truck. Karen's gone, learning her lesson the hard way. The neighbors are happy, and the street's peaceful. But the big idea? That sticks with us. Quiet can be strong. Smart can be tough. You don't have to look big to be big. That's what Jake showed us, and it's something you can carry with you every day. So, what do you think, friends? Did Karen get what she deserved? I say yes, she was mean, and she paid for it. But I want to hear from you. Drop a yes or no in the comments below. Tell me what you'd do if you were Jake. Would you use a camera? Would you stay quiet? Maybe you've got your own story about a bully you outsmarted. Share it. I love reading what you say. It makes this more fun. Oh, and one more thing, keep watching for more stories. I'll see you in the next one. Maybe it'll be about another sneaky hero, or maybe a silly bad guy who trips over their own feet. Who knows? Stick around, and we'll find out together. You're the best, and I can't wait to hang out with you again. Bye for now, stay strong, stay smart, and maybe keep a camera handy. You never know when it'll come in clutch.